Welcome to Frederick Meyer Gardens and Sculpture Park. My name's Joe Becker, and I'm the Chief Curator and Vice President for Collections and Exhibitions. And we're here to celebrate the members' opening of this very important exhibition, Looking East, Facing West, The World of Zhang Huan. And probably this is an exhibition that is a little bit different than many of the other exhibitions that you've attended here, or maybe at other institutions, or maybe it rings familiar. And what I'd like to do tonight is to walk you through Zhang Huan's development and hit some of the highlights of this exhibition. And then, of course, we'll save a few minutes for ourselves at the very end for question and answer. Before I actually start with my prepared materials, first of all, I'd like to thank the Daniel and Pamela DeVos Foundation, who are the underwriters for this exhibition. In addition, the Meyer Foundation, the Botanic and Sculpture Societies of Frederick Meyer Gardens and Sculpture Park, Grand Rapids Community College, and Aquinas College. So thank you all very much. I also want to call your attention to the gallery guide. Take this with you, take this home for a couple of reasons. Number one, there's great information in terms of how the exhibition is laid out and some of the iconic pieces for the exhibition. As you open it up, you'll see that there are several very significant opportunities this summer to experience the exhibition and the permanent collection that the Education Department has offered. The Perspectives series is set for June 7th. The gallery walk with Professor Craig Hansen at Calvin College. If you've never heard Craig speak, do enjoy it. It's a tremendous opportunity. Another gallery walk with John Stella. And then finally, at the end of summer, Curator's Choice. I also want to call your attention to the large map. And most of the works outside in the sculpture park are marked by a black dot. There are two which are marked by a tan dot, dark tan dot. These are two major acquisitions that are now part of the permanent collection. Some of you have already heard about, and some of you may have already seen the new site-specific piece by Richard Serra. And we're just in the process with the Horticulture Department finishing up the George Siegel, which is an addition to the gallery section of the sculpture park. So it's a great opportunity to get out there in the summer when it's not raining or hailing or performing some other very interesting task, or maybe you like the rain and the hail. But two wonderful additions to the permanent collection. So without further ado, take this home and let's go ahead and talk about Zhang Huan. Can we bring the lights down, please? I want to spend just a couple of minutes reflecting on the title. And I know sometimes the titles of exhibitions can be superfluous, but I tend to take them pretty seriously because I hope that they offer some foundational information to what the exhibition is about. It's also a great opportunity to use a colon. And this exhibition, Looking East and Facing West, really sets the tone for what you've experienced and what, after I hope is an insightful lecture tonight for you, is an opportunity to go back in and enjoy the exhibition once again. Because we have an artist that really helps us to see into two worlds that at times seem as if they're becoming one world, and then at other times seem to remain set in their ways of otherworldly experiences. Looking East, this is an artist that I think you've probably figured out by now is Chinese, very much tied to his history, his heritage, his cultural traditions. But this is also an artist that spent some significant time in the West, specifically in the United States, and offers many of us as Westerners some keys to understanding his culture and his hopes and visions, and I think you would probably also say prayers for his culture as well. Zhang Huan is extremely well known on both coasts, having had major exhibitions in New York and in Los Angeles and in San Francisco. This is his first major presentation in the Midwest, and so we're very grateful to him and to Pace Gallery for allowing this to happen. So if you've peeked into the gallery already, you might recognize this is one of 20 stills. That's a part of his performance piece called Skin. But so is this. And one of the things that really intrigued me years ago when I was first introduced to his work is that the artist is very honest, very forthright with himself, because he sees himself really as a kind of key to understanding his culture and maybe introducing his culture to Western audiences. He is not an artist that fits very neatly into any one specific category. This is an artist that is, yes, a sculptor, but you probably already saw he's also a painter, and he is a photographer, and he is a videographer, and he is a performance art. And one of the delightful things about dealing with so many contemporary artists is that it's almost impossible to put them in any one specific category. They seem to squirm and move about into other categories, and certainly Zhang Huan is somebody that feels very comfortable in his own skin, pun intended, but also an artist that feels very comfortable utilizing a variety of media, although he really doesn't do performance work any longer. The name might not be familiar to you, but this is certainly one of the most significant Chinese contemporary artists working today. A leader not only within China, but an ambassador, so to speak, to the rest of the world. Perhaps you've heard or you've read or maybe you've even seen some of the works of Ai Weiwei, a much more verbal, a much more sort of media-oriented, a much more controversial or at least lightning rod kind of figure. Yes, they are contemporaries, but Zhang Huan's work has other, perhaps even deeper dimensions to it than, for example, Ai Weiwei's. A few things that I want to lay out as a foundation to understand this exhibition. And again, you may be encountering some ideas and some works that are a little bit different than we usually present, or maybe that you've usually seen in a museum or gallery sense. First of all, this is an artist that uses himself as a vehicle for expressing many of his ideas. And by using himself, it's not just making it autobiographical, but oftentimes it's an artist that actually uses his own body. And we'll explore this theme in just a little bit. This is an artist that looks very deeply, very intensely, very passionately at China. And China in numerous layers, or China in numerous levels. Historical China, China of the 20th century, and the ever-expanding, ever-reinventing China of today. This is also an artist that is keenly aware of the West, in particular the United States and American audiences and what their thoughts and needs and desires are. But for my personal purposes, both as a curator, but really also as a human being, the thing that really strikes me about so much of his work is his humanism. And that if you move beyond the imagery, whether it's using his body, or it's conducting a performance work, or it's using things that are associated with historical China, or things that are associated with Buddhism, you begin to realize this is an artist that's deeply, deeply moved and concerned about humanity today and humanity moving into the future. And again, one of the key figures of contemporary Chinese art. Now, moment of self-revelation here. Zhang Huan and I are the same age. We were born in 1965. I'll let you do the math. And when we were together this December planning this exhibition, what we'd like to show, what we thought some of the key themes were, and so on and so forth, my comment to him was, when I was in graduate school, when I was studying art history in the late 1980s and early 1990s, I knew nothing about contemporary Chinese art. There wasn't such a thing as a market that stemmed from Beijing or from Shanghai. And very wryly and very wisely, Zhang Huan turned to me and he said, well, of course you weren't studying it because I hadn't done anything yet. And although he uses humor, and he uses humor very wisely, I think that it points to a very significant thing, that the art world has changed dramatically in the course of the last 20, 25 years. The simple fact that one of the most important markets for contemporary art is now found in China, and that Beijing and Shanghai are counted alongside New York and London and Berlin as major artistic centerpieces is really quite significant. And to illustrate that, I thought I'd start with a couple of iconic images that you might recognize. Those of you that are regulars to the Art Institute of Chicago probably recognize this wonderful, enormous, I think it's almost 15 feet in height, paintings by Andy Warhol of Mao. And in his own sort of late pop fashion, what has Warhol done? But he's taken a photograph, he has manipulated the surfaces of the photograph, he's introduced bright color, but he's really treating Mao as a kind of celebrity in the way that he treated Elvis as a celebrity, or Marilyn Monroe or Elizabeth Taylor as a celebrity. But he certainly had his fingers, that's Warhol, on his time and place, and was commenting in 1973 on events from 1972, which is when Richard Nixon went to China. Very significant event that many of you will probably remember. It was really a point of origin for channels of communication that continue to develop and to unfold today. But going back to my personal revelation to you is that when I was studying art as an undergraduate and as a graduate student, when we thought about China, we thought about China. We thought about China of distant reaches, and we thought about China in terms of a distant past. We thought about, for example, the terracotta warriors, which go back to the 2nd century BC. We all thought about, and we had sort of romantic visions of traveling and experiencing places like the Great Wall. We were thinking about China way, 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 way before the 20th century. We certainly weren't thinking about China of the late 20th century or the early 21st century. But as we all know, our understanding and our appreciation of China really began to change in the last quarter of the 20th century. And it really began to change not only for those of us on the outside, but as I think you'll see in a few minutes with Zhang Huan, it began to change on the inside as well. And we can't afford not to think about moments like this at Tiananmen Square that brought the changes within China to the attention of an increasing world marketplace and a CNN information-driven Western society. So having said that, and giving you some perspective about art history as we understood it and as we studied it, and as we hung it on museum walls, and as we curated it into exhibitions, think about how much Zhang Huan and his colleagues and what I'm going to be sharing with you in the next 20 minutes or so really set a new tone and set a new pace for what's happening in the world today. A little bit of information about Zhang Huan. He was born in 1965, as already revealed. When he was born, his parents felt that it was best that he live with his maternal grandmother in the countryside. And so for the first 8 years, he did live with his maternal grandmother. He has very fond, very strong memories about living in the countryside, the kind of rituals, the kind of connectedness to the earth, the kind of history, the kind of traditions, the role, the responsibility of family, this notion of work, really very significant to him. When he was 8, he moved back with his parents, and by the time he was in 5th grade, he had developed a real sensitivity towards drawing, and it was recognized by several of his teachers. He was afforded the opportunity to take art classes. Art wasn't a part of the regular curriculum, but he was also afforded the opportunity to study art at summer camps. And what happened in a very short period of time is he recognized he could really draw like an old master. So it was something that was encouraged, it was something in which he delighted, and obviously it sent him on a kind of career path. He studied at Henan University, and he studied painting. And one thing that's important to note is the kind of painting that was being studied and was being held out as significant in China for most of the second half of the 20th century. And that was a kind of realism, and in particular, what we recognize in the art history world as a kind of Soviet-style realism. Something that's very graphic, something that's very illustrative, something that's made to tell a story, or maybe something that's intended to sell a story. So Zhang Huan begins as a painter, and he begins as a painter in a very traditional style, very representational style. Add into this mix something that was being made aware of, although it's 20, 25 years after the fact, sort of a pop art aesthetic, where the graphic quality of the work, the representational, the realistic style of the work comes into being, but also messages from advertising come into play. And you can see this reference here to Porsche and a little bit of a script down here at the bottom right-hand side as well. This is the kind of thing that was held out as good art. This is the kind of artwork that, at least in the 1980s, Zhang Huan excelled. However, he moves to Beijing, and in Beijing, the art world was rapidly, rapidly changing. Talk about a hothouse environment, Beijing in the 1990s, and really leading until today, very much a kind of hothouse environment. Oftentimes in its origins with ideas coming from the outside, ideas coming from the West, very specifically ideas coming from the United States. And there are two things that I want you to take with you as we move through this exhibition. Number one, his exposure to conceptual art. And number two, his exposure to performance art. And there is a relationship, obviously, but conceptual art and performance art. Conceptual art says that the concept, root word here, the concept, the idea is the most important. The form, what it actually looks like, is oftentimes secondary. The materials are oftentimes secondary or tertiary, but the ideas are very, very important. And one of the Western artists that really changed things for Zhang Huan and many of his contemporaries was the American conceptual artist Kiki Smith. And some of you probably recognize Kiki Smith, the photograph at the left-hand side, and then at the right-hand side, Sleepwalker, which is installed in our permanent collection. The other thing that was so instrumental and was completely and totally new to China in the late 1980s, early 1990s was performance art. Performance art, obviously the artist is performing, is using themselves, and frequently they're using their body. Instead of using a canvas, instead of using paint, instead of using bronze or clay or string or whatever the materials you might be thinking of, this is an artist that is using their own body. They perform something to communicate an idea or a story. Some of you might be familiar with Marina Abramovich, probably one of the most celebrated performance artists of our time. She had a very, very successful exhibition at New York's Museum of Modern Art last year. And here are a series of stills, oftentimes from a performance piece, which is passing, which is transitory. It's the stills, it's the photographs that remain to document the experience. And here she is twisting and turning, and she's moving, and she's manipulating her own figure. Her own figure is her canvas. And so this obviously has a direct impact and a direct relationship to something like this, that large wall that fills the end of the bulk gallery called Skin. Excuse me. And here we see an artist that is tweaking his face, he's touching his own face, he's covering his ears, he's covering his nose. He's, in a sense, touching himself in a way to verify his own existence, to verify his own feelings, his own emotions. This was an incredibly important breakthrough for the artist. Someone who was taught traditional drawing, taught traditional painting, taught traditional art-making techniques, to be introduced to something that in the West had been around for quite some time, but in China was very, very new. That the body and the performance could communicate a whole set of different ideas. Now I'm going to take you through a couple of his performance pieces, and perhaps at first glance they might be a little bit unusual, maybe even the first two that I'll show you as a forewarning here, maybe even a little bit disturbing, but they're done with intent. They're done with an idea in mind. They're done with a message in mind. Not through canvas, not through charcoal, not through bronze, not through marble, but with the body itself. Some of you probably saw this still right when you walk into the galleries and were wondering, what's going on here? This is called 12 meters square. It dates to 1994, and it was one of the performance pieces that brought him really to the leadership role of the Chinese avant-garde. In this very difficult performance, the artist used himself, smeared himself with honey and fish oil, and sat in a public restroom in Beijing for several hours and allowed, in a very difficult way, the flies to collect and gather across his skin, across his flesh. Something that would give most of us the heebie-jeebies, something that most of us would choose to avoid. Why is he doing this? Well, he did this with a very specific purpose in mind. He wanted to call attention to the horrible facilities that were available to the public, the kind of lavatories and facilities that most men and women had the opportunity to use if they were general workers on the street or if they were individuals that were simply passing through. Didn't they deserve better? Didn't they deserve more? But yet when you put yourself in an awkward position and you allow yourself to be photographed, you have some kind of document. Maybe you have some kind of evidence that you can say, here, I'm not just talking about this, I'm actually showing you this. Even more difficult, and I'll caution you here in advance, a piece that he did called Angel. This was a performance piece that took place on the steps of the National Art Museum in Beijing. He uses his own body, which is smeared with red food coloring and baby dolls, and uses it as a way to protest the one-child policy in China. So he's utilizing himself as the subject. He's utilizing himself as the material. And it's a performance that for many people was able to call attention to a situation, was able to call attention to an idea in a way that perhaps a piece of literature or a film or even a documentary simply could not. What happens is that by 1998 he realizes that he needs to go to New York. And he settles in New York and finds himself in this unusual environment, very different. And one of the things that I'd like you all to think about are your opportunities to travel. Because one of the things that happens when we travel is that our senses, in a sense, are heightened. We oftentimes are able to focus in not just on the place that's new to us, but in some ways we're able to reflect inward on ourselves in sharper, clear ways. This is once you get through the jet lag. And he was given several critical opportunities. One, shortly after he arrived, was at the Museum of Modern Art's PS1, which is an experimental place in Brooklyn. And this was the performance piece that he put on, and there are three elements that are part of the work. Number one, you can see that there's this Ming-style bed. So there is this element which connects him to China. Number two, there is this very unconventional mattress. It's a huge block of ice. And number three, if you look around the foreground area, there are all of these New Yorkers and their dogs. So what does a Ming-style bed and a block of ice and a bunch of well-cared-for dogs have to do with one another? Well, for him, this was about his experiences as a Chinese coming to New York, dealing with America, and trying to fit in. Because the base element to this all, the base element to Zhang Huan, is Chinese. It's the bed. The block of ice is something that is cold and difficult, but it's also something that transforms. Think about laying on a bed of ice, thinking about sitting in a cold car, thinking about scraping your windshield. Does that experience change you in any way? Is it a temporary change, or is it a permanent change? Coming to a new culture, coming to New York, as someone from another country, is it a permanent change? Is it a temporary change? And the element of the dogs is actually kind of an interesting and insightful piece of information about American culture. When he came here, he couldn't believe how well Americans treated their dogs. He said that Americans treated their dogs sometimes better than they treated other Americans. And they had fancy collars and designer collars, and they were talked to and they were given kisses and snacks and so on and so forth, when there were people that were starving in the streets. And there were people just a block away from where these very fancy dogs lived that were looking for a handout and they needed shelter. So what kind of culture was this that he was stepping into that could treat their pets in one way, but thought about, or maybe didn't think about, their fellow human beings in that same way? But this idea of physical change connected to emotional and intellectual change remained very, very critical for the artist, especially for his performance work that he does from the late 1990s until the middle of the 2000s. The second work that I wanted to share with you is called My New York, and it dates to 2002, and it was something that he did for the Whitney Biennale, which is probably one of the most prestigious events in the American art world. And for this, he made this giant meat suit. And he walked around Manhattan, especially in Midtown, wearing this meat suit. And I was saying yesterday, imagine going to show up at the Today Show so you could, wave to Al Roker, and then this guy in a meat suit comes walking by. What do you make of this? Was this a stunt? Well, I guess in part it was a stunt, but it was also, again, a way for him to think about where he was and what was happening. When he came to the United States, he couldn't believe how much meat Americans ate. He couldn't believe how large American portions were. He couldn't believe how large Americans were. But he also saw the meat and the way that it was able to be manipulated as a kind of muscle suit. and the way in which so many Americans attended to their appearances as a way to make them seem one way when they really weren't that way necessarily. He saw the suit as a kind of armor, as a kind of protection, and realized that not just Americans, but all human beings have this tendency to put on their own form of personal armor when they go out for the day. How are they going to present themselves to their family? How are they going to present themselves to the world? So although there is this element of humor, there is a very interesting, very strong, very sort of biting reflection on his perception of the world, not just towards America, but the world at large through a project like this. But go back to that comment that I made a few minutes ago about looking at the culture when you travel, but also looking at yourself. And one of the things that he found very clearly happening is that in his time in the United States, he found himself longing for China. And he realized he needed to start to connect with his roots, with his history in a more meaningful way. And so rather than just being incidental or maybe a prop like that Ming-style bed, he realized that he had to incorporate traditional elements of Chinese culture in his work when he was here in the United States. And probably one of the most celebrated of his works came from 2000. It was called the Family Tree Series. And in the Family Tree Series, he hired three traditional Chinese calligraphers. And he asked them very, very specifically to illustrate across the surface of his face certain words, certain ideas, certain phrases, or parables, and to repeat that information over and over and over and over again, so that these original Chinese words and phrases and parables and these beautiful elements of Chinese calligraphy began to merge with one another, and they began to cover the face, and they began to unify the face, and then they began to disguise the face, so that the face that you first encountered at the beginning of the day, and this was a day-long project, was actually lost behind this mask. And that the mask, in a sense, represented everyone. That the mask hid individual identities and blemishes across the face. And it became a kind of statement for him about not just an identity, but about humanity. And again, going back to one of my comments that I made very early on this evening, it was one of the ways in which he, in a sense, distinguished himself then, but distinguished himself even today from other more avant-garde Chinese contemporary artists. In late 2005, 2006, he and his wife made a decision to move back to China with their two small children, and specifically to move not to Beijing, but to Shanghai. And he wanted to develop his artistic practices there. And several very significant themes that he had been thinking about, things that came out of this longing, this missing, this wistfulness about China took root and are followed through even until today. The first of these that we'll explore is that of the worker. Remember his early childhood in rural China, living with his grandmother, how he so very much began to appreciate the role of workers. And he has a very close tie, even until today, with workers. And one of the most amazing projects that he was able to orchestrate, it's a performance piece, something that we actually have running on continuous loop in the gallery, involved 39 workers, 39 migrant workers, male workers, and one small child. And here you can see Zhang Huan in a still from behind. Here you can actually see him entering into the pond with that one small child on his shoulders. The title of the work is called "To Raise the Level of Water in a Fish Pond." And the idea is that here are these 39 migrant workers, these migrant laborers, anonymous. They walk together with Zhang Huan into a relatively small fish pond. And that together, their communal efforts raise the level of water. They raised it by about 1 meter. So the idea here is looking at the laborer, thinking about the laborer, not just in Chinese culture, but in so many cultures, past and present, and how the collective efforts join together to raise up the civilization, raise up the quality of the culture, promote the quality, move it forward in some way. How to raise the level of water in a fish pond is ultimately about how to raise the level of water for the entire community. And the one small child on the master's shoulder, he's the future. The communal efforts not only raise the water, but they raise and they support the future. The worker, a continued theme of great importance for Zhang Huan. The second theme is his connection and his devotion to Buddhism. And he talks about the fact that as a young man, as a young artist, his connection to Buddhism was very slight. As a matter of fact, it came through music. Whenever he was working very intensely, he would listen to Western-style rock and roll, but whenever he wanted something that was more calming and more contemplative, he would turn to, for example, Buddhist chants. But when he returns to China, he becomes very involved with Buddhism. He said something to me which I thought was very significant. He feels that Buddhism connects him to his ancestors. He feels that Buddhism connects him to his personal and to his cultural history. And that when he first began to pray as a Buddhist, he prayed for himself. But that as time went on and his faith deepened, he prayed for his family and he prayed for his staff. And finally, where he is today in terms of his own spiritual and philosophical development, he prays for peace on earth. So again, this idea of humanity coming out in and through the work. But Buddhism is a subject, but it's also part of the object frequently. How does he do this? When he came back to China, he was very surprised that the incense ash from the incense rods that were offered at temples was thrown away. Traditionally, that incense ash, is my understanding, is either buried or it is put at sea. It's deposited in the sea. And he felt that, this incense ash, although it was burnt and it was for many people an after the fact a remnant, was potent. It was about hopes. It was about prayers, it was about worries, it was about families, it was about blessings, it was about intentions, and that somehow he should use it. And so he began to collect this incense ash. And even today, he and his assistants go to about 20 individual temples in and around Shanghai. They collect the ash, they sort it according to color, and then they incorporate it into both paintings and sculptures, which is pretty remarkable. You wouldn't necessarily connect his belief systems and his connection to a certain kind of history when you look at some of the paintings, but when you begin to explore it a little bit deeper, it's actually quite remarkable. But then again, this is an artist that was brave enough to use his own body as his materials. The way that the ash paintings are made is that they're made flat. It's not sort of, Rembrandt-style canvas on an easel facing it in front of you. They're painted on the ground. And the ash is layered in. It's layered in according to the color. And then you can see he is drawing into the surface of the ash. then ash is sort of sprinkled further across the surface. Sometimes you can actually see the little bits and pieces of the incense rods themselves, and then a fixative or a binder is placed across the surface of the painting, in this instance, before it's held upright. And I think perhaps the closest notion that most of us can get is to think about, rather than icing a cake, kind of dusting the surface of a cake or dusting the surface of cookies with powdered sugar. Do that on a more intense level and with lots of texture, and you're getting somewhat close to what he's doing here. His images can be small and intimate, or his images can be sort of medium-sized scale, but they can also be very, very large, as you saw in the galleries. And if you haven't seen it yet, please go into the galleries afterwards, such as this image right here. Most of his images, the vast majority of his images, actually come from a huge, huge repertoire of photographs that he has scavenged and that he has saved from across the 20th century, literally from the 1920s and 1930s through to the 1970s and 1980s. He's very, very, very much concerned about preserving history and about preserving culture in China. One of the most remarkable things that he said to me during our visit was that, he thought it was wonderful, fine that China was moving forward and was becoming so big, but in the process, it can't forget its past, both its immediate past, but also its distant past. And so the idea that he's using ash, which is connect to the ash from these temples, the idea that these images are actually based on historical photographs from across the 20th century, does that in a twofold way. He also makes ash sculptures. And the first ash sculptures that he made were temporary. They were sort of held in a mold. Think about a bundt pan, or think about almost like a spring mold, and then they were released. They didn't last very long, and then they eventually collapsed. And then he began putting a binder, like a concrete, in the mix, building up the surfaces, and then finally spreading a layer of ash across the surface to give it that kind of final flourish of texture and interest. The idea of using something from one way of living and one tradition and reinvigorating it in another tradition is also a part of these memory doors, and we have two that are a part of the exhibition. Think about them as large-scale relief sculptures. This is an artist that collects things that are related to China's past. These are actually old wooden doors from the countryside that were used for both houses and granaries and even sometimes small barns. So they've been around for centuries. And in the course of the last 20, 30 years in particular, many of the farmers, many of the people in the countryside were getting rid of these wooden doors because they wanted the metal-style Western doors, which were commercially made. And just as he was sort of disturbed that the ashes were being thrown away, he thought that, throwing away these wooden doors that had been touched by generations of individuals for something that was sleek and modern but also anonymous was kind of sad. So he collected these wooden doors. Nobody wanted a dime for them in the beginning. And he began repurposing them as the basis of sculpture. And I think perhaps one tradition, thinking about the way in which many people reuse barn doors or planks from the exterior of barns. They use them, to make tables. They use them to make paneling. They find new creative uses for that kind of Americana. Well, this is a slightly parallel version to this. Although the imagery here is also derived from photographs. That same inventory of photographs that are the basis for the paintings are the basis for these memory doors. And he has hired woodworkers, traditional woodworkers, to go in, take these images which are laid across the surface of the doors, and then begin to carve into the surfaces. So the second example, which is a part of the exhibition, But here, this might give you some idea about how these were made. Up at the top left-hand corner, from a May parade, you've got one of these traditional photographs. This is, I think, from the 1930s or the 1940s. But at the bottom right-hand side, you have the surface, a detail of the surface of one of the doors and some of the carving materials. Although Zhang Huan has a large workshop, he employs about 100 individuals. Only about 5% of them actually have an art degree or an art background. Most of them are traditional artisans, where he doesn't want their craft to escape. He doesn't want their craft to die because of manufacturing. So he has this whole team of traditional wood carvers that made chairs, that made some filigree work. They never thought about their work as art, but he supervises them and works with them in order to create projects like this. So another sort of twofold way of connecting with the history of China and connecting with traditional Chinese craftsmanship. A third element, and we have one example, there are not too many that are available for exhibition purposes, are his monuments to Confucius. And in the last 20 years in particular, there's been sort of a reappreciation, reevaluation of Confucius. There's a wonderful ash painting that's in the main gallery that features Confucius sort of seated almost in a Renaissance fashion, framed by that doorway. It's an incredible, incredible painting, and with all of the surface, with all of the textures, with all of those individual elements of the ash that are still made available. And then the final element are the sculptures. The sculptures which are made primarily in copper, and the sculptures which probably have the most overt connection to Buddhism. Among the many collections that Zhang Huan has, and he literally has large warehouses where he works, but also where he puts these collections together, are pieces which are based on fragments of Buddhist statuary which were destroyed in the 20th century. Many of them come from Tibet and from Southeast Asia. Zhang Huan refuses to be political about the situation, but he feels that saving as many of these fragments as possible is important, but he also says that in general, all war and all destruction comes from and leads to further misery. And so, in a sense, what he's talking about here are works that are made from fragments, but he's not in any way trying to create new religious icons. As a matter of fact, in this Bodhisattva image, it's his own face which is utilized across the back. The true icon for the show, the one that you've probably seen in the press, it was on the front page of Grand Rapids Press, I understand, tonight, and in the entertainment section, is called the Long Island Buddha. And he, again, doesn't see these as religious objects per se. He sees these as examples of contemporary art that is based on historical fragments. And when you look at the surface of these sculptures, you'll notice that there are rough seams. You notice that there are dents. You know that there are uneven surfaces. Again, he's not trying to create something that would be used in a religious context. He's trying to create something that is a work of art, but which is based on a certain tradition and is connected to his own belief system. The wonderful thing related to this piece is that he created a series of drawings which have never been shown before. There are 12 drawings. He sent 8 for us for the exhibition. One of the interesting things about Zhang Huan, and this is parallel to what you might remember from the Annika Beaumont show, which closed just a few weeks ago, is that his drawings are done not in preparation for a project, but they're done as a sort of meditation after a project is complete. So these wonderful diaphanous works sort of help him to reflect on what he's already done, but helped him to imagine environments, outdoor environments, obviously with this long shadow where the works can be placed. Some very thick and very bold, others very light, very ghost-like, quite diaphanous. And another one here. I like this one in particular because it shows you the individual seams. And again, you know, he's not using artisans and a foundry that think about themselves as artists. He's using craftsmen to help him realize his artistic endeavors. And one more. Oh, two more. Excuse me, I fibbed. This is called Long Island Buddha. He made 3 of them. The first he made for a private collection on Long Island. The second he made and he kept for himself. And the third he made for Frederick Meyer Gardens and Sculpture Park. This is now a piece that will become a part of the permanent collection. So, this is a little bit of an overview of Zhang Huan. Hopefully it's some helpful information for you to understand. Very unusual and challenging and complex and ultimately, I hope, rewarding exhibition. If we raise the lights, we can take a couple of questions. Thank you. Paul, I knew you'd be there.
Yeah. The raising the water in the fish pond video, that's just about the time that they were building the Three Gorges Dam.
You know, I haven't heard him speak of that or read about that, but, you know, it could very well be. Could very well be. I don't know the answer to that. That's an excellent observation. Yes? I think he picked Shanghai because he felt that Beijing had become so overgrown for the artist community, you know, just sort of super intense. And he knew that he also wanted to work on a very large scale, and that to find an enormous studio still in close proximity to the center of the city would be very difficult in Beijing. So in Shanghai, which is a very large city itself, there were some additional opportunities, and he does have an extremely large and very productive and very insightful studio. It's about 25-30 minutes outside of the city, depending on the traffic. Yeah. Yes?
This man spent time in America, then took his children and wife back to China. Does he expect that his children may be educated in America?
His children are educated in China, but also in England. And they travel a lot. The family travels a lot. And they spend the most amount of time in China. But I think that one of his hopes for his children is that they can sort of take things even further than he can and really see this as a global community. Not just, you know, America, not just China, but really, you know, engage in a global community. Yeah. Choice, yeah. Interesting, he and his wife have set up a foundation, a private foundation, and the primary mission of the foundation is to support schools in China. Pretty impressive for someone in their 40s. There's another hand over here. Yes?
Is he acknowledged as a fine artist in China?
He is. You know, he is celebrated. He's also been controversial sometimes. As a matter of fact, on the eve of a major exhibition in Shanghai, the exhibition was closed. You know, the exhibition was already placed, the catalog was already printed, but the officials were a little bit worried about how far he might take things. But he tries not to be that forceful and that political, and to try to talk about the issues of the human condition and the issues of humanity. And that, in many ways, is what sets him apart from someone like Ai Weiwei. Yes?
With China's one-child policy, how does he manage more than one child?
Well, there are exceptions to that policy, and one of them is the fact that both of the children were born in the United States. And his wife is Chinese. His wife is Chinese. Yes. Well, I think that let me answer the second question. You know, to be a performance artist, especially when your body is so very integral to what you're trying to communicate, it's pretty grueling. And I think he reached a certain point in time where he just felt that physically he couldn't withstand, you know, the kind of intensities, you know, laying on beds of ice, being suspended, and so on and so forth, any further. But in many ways, he sees, although they're not technically performance pieces, he sees the way that he works with ash across the surface. He sees the sort of act of creating his paintings, his sculptures, his prints, as drawings, as a meditative experience, but also as a performance experience. And yes, he did catch quite a lot of flack in his early days, but most of the artists that were sort of young and unconventional were in the same boat. It wasn't necessarily just him, it was the whole group. Great questions. Yeah, Chris. Yes. After. Men occasionally make fashion statements first. Occasionally, very occasionally. Yeah, that's an excellent question. You know, performance art has been around, you know, in the West throughout most of the 20th century, and there are oftentimes these documents that survive, sometimes by chance, sometimes by choice. Photography is the primary means, whether it's a happening from the 1950s and early 1960s, or whether it's something from the Dada experience. You know, occasionally there are these photographs that survive, and they are seen as a work of art in and of themselves. More and more, especially in the 80s, starting out in the West with artists like Bill Viola, the idea was that you could actually make a film or a video or now a DVD. That's what we're playing here. So there are people that collect those kind of works of art as they would collect, for example, a print in a limited edition. You know, the parallel that I made to some of the volunteers the other day is, you know, think back to Andy Goldsworthy. You know, Andy Goldsworthy does so many temporary works. You know, the leaves only stay in that configuration for a very brief period of time, then they're blown away or they're washed away. It's that click snapshot that becomes the document that becomes the work of art. And he does see them as works of art, not just as documents. That's an excellent question. Time for one more. Yes?
Is this particular piece cast, or is it put together in sheets of copper?
Both. There are elements of it that are cast, and there are elements that are actually forged and put together. So if you go back in the gallery, you'll see that each one of the little units of the hair have actually been welded to the surface. Very unconventional if you think about, you know, sort of classic bronze casting. Great question. Well, thank you all very much. Hope you enjoy the exhibition.